This presentation is called Principles of Graphic Design, Applied Terms. As I examined the different terms that we were exploring this week for class, I organized them into two broad sections: conceptual forms of organization and spatial organization. Conceptual organization may include such concepts as chunking, hierarchy, gestalt, repetition, and closure. Spatial organization deals more with the way that information is laid out or presented visually, auditorily, or otherwise in a learning environment. Some concepts that belong here include things like the golden rectangle, proximity, balance, and contrast. Let's start by looking at some of those conceptual organization concepts. The first one I want to focus on is this idea of chunk or chunking. Henry Poincaré once said, "Science is built of facts, the way a house is built of bricks, but an accumulation of facts is no more science than a pile of bricks is a house." I think Poincaré was onto something here, and I think it applies not only to science, but to all knowledge and all facts as a constructivist. For example, let me show you this image of several different topics laid out on the screen. I'll show you for a few seconds, and I want you to remember, where was topic 4 on the screen? Topic 3? Topic 7? Do you recall? If you find it difficult, you can self-check here. It might be because these separate bits of data have no way of being organized in your short-term memory. Whereas, if I gave it some sort of organization, for example, clustering them by odds and even, and I covered it up again, you would have no problems telling me where a 6 or a 5 or a 2 were, because they have a cluster. You're not trying to remember 8 separate bits of information, but only 2 broad chunks of information, which is much, much easier to store in your short-term memory. I could also organize it numerically, 1 through 3, 4 to 5, 6 through 8, and you only have 3 or maybe even 1 chunk of information for organizing these. This goes back to something that a fellow named Miller talked about in 1956. He suggested in a now famous paper that a working memory dealt with these bits of information and chunks of information, suggesting that chunks are functions of short-term memory, where, according to him, these bits of information could be clustered together into these chunks of information, which makes it easier to remember. The reason for this is that Miller suggested that we can remember seven bits of information, if you will, in our short-term memory at any given time. Now, when we cluster bits of information into a chunk, then we can memorize 7 chunks of information, where previously we could only memorize 7 bits of information. In this case, you can see on the board that we're really just looking at the 3 chunks. 1 through 3, 4 and 5, 6 and 8, 6 through 8 are chunks of organized bits of information. And so there's really only 3 things for you to remember here, which is quite easy. You might also be remembering the fact that it is sequential, 1 through 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. But again, that makes sense, and it's easy to cluster together that information rather than simply memorizing separate, incongruent bits of information. Now, another way we can think about this idea of chunking is how we organize content when we develop, for example, a course. So we might look at how these separate topics can actually be organized together to fit into one lesson. So if topics 1 through 3 have some form of similarity or they work together in some way that makes sense, we could cluster them into a single lesson, and so forth with the other clusters. Those clusters could then be further clustered into a unit or module. So we have one huge chunk of information. Maybe it's cellular division. Maybe it's the War of 1812. Something that's going to be one large chunk of information that was made up of several chunks of lessons that were made up of several chunks of topics that were made up of several bits of information. When we begin organizing content into lessons, into units or modules, and so on and so forth, we're expanding and contracting this idea of chunking. We're getting a little bit beyond what Miller was suggesting, but I think it's still relevant to explore that concept in a broader view. Also relevant to this idea, we're getting into this idea of hierarchy. When we talk about hierarchy, we're basically thinking about how big ideas frame smaller ideas and helps us as designers to organize these things. So we've already begun a hierarchy here where the topics are subsumed by lessons and the lessons are subsumed by units. From a design perspective, I would want to start as broad as possible first. First determining, for example, the goals of my unit, and then expressing how those goals might be broken up into smaller learning objectives that could be covered in lessons. And then I might determine specific activities that would address a bit or a topic of information that would support the goal of the lesson, that would support the goal of the unit. And designing this way helps ensure that all of the lessons, all of the learning activities are working towards some broad ultimate focus of the instruction. Of course, we have more than one unit when we organize courses, and so we might look, for example, at how 3 units are used to develop a course, which has course objectives, and that course might belong to a course sequence, which itself has objectives, and that may be part of, for example, a degree program, which has objectives unto itself, most likely preparing students for being professionals in a specific field. Such a goal is far too lofty for any one learning activity to accomplish, but a learning activity can support a lesson, which can support a unit, which can support a course, which can support a course sequence, which can support a program, and ultimately we prepare professionals. This is also related to the idea of Gestalt. Ultimately, the program is more than simply a number of educational experiences thrown together. Going back to Poincare's comment, it's not simply a pile of bricks. How we organize the learning experiences, how we organize the lessons, the units, the courses, the sequence, the program influences what students get out of it. So this idea of Gestalt can apply to the organization of courses conceptually. It also applies visually, which is getting into the other type of organization, but briefly, when you look at this image that I have on the screen right now, it is not simply a number of boxes with text in them, but an organization of a hierarchy, a way of presenting the relationship between these different concepts. Again, the course itself would have something more than just the lessons and so forth. Okay, then we have this idea. So far we've been exploring how things like hierarchy and Gestalt and the organization of content can help make sure that students understand what they're learning and bring them to a place that's more than the sum of their parts and help design that type of experience. But how do we move students from having conceptual understanding to remembering that long term? Well, one practice that we talked about this week is that of repetition, where instead of, for example, only covering topics 1, 2, and 3 in the first lesson, I might find a way to bring these topics that I learned in earlier lessons into later lessons as reviews, as applied circumstances, as a constructivist notion of we're going to take concepts 1 and 3 and we're going to add to them to get to concepts 4 and 5 and so forth. But by repeating things across lessons, this is one way that repetition can occur. Of course, we can also do repetition within a lesson, talking about the same thing multiple times, doing drills, doing homework between lessons. There are a number of ways of doing this. But the point is that it is very difficult for people to permanently remember, store information in long-term memory based on only a single exposure. By being exposed to a concept repeatedly, especially over time, it helps ensure long-term memory storage. Another concept that's relevant to supporting retention is that of closure. Closure works like in the development of a lesson. We want to ensure that people have a sense of a lesson coming to an end. And I think that this fits with the broader scope in which we help students focus on a concept, move them through a learning experience, and then provide closure. To me, these three move together. So for example, in a given lesson, I might tell my students, today we're going to be learning about topics 1, 2, and 3. Now these are important because of this, and these are some things that I want you to be watching for. Are you ready? And then we move into a learning experience in which the students interact with topics 1, 2, and 3 through discussion, through hands-on activity, through lecture, whatever the teaching and learning experiences that I've designed are, the students move through that. And finally we get to a point of closure, in which at this point I might facilitate a reflection activity. This might be an activity such as I used to think and now I think, or a KWL chart. It might be providing or eliciting a summary of the learning from the students. Or it might be some sort of a homework activity that allows them to put the concepts that they learned today into practice and thus demonstrate to themselves a degree of mastery. Whatever the case, providing closure is very helpful in helping sustain that retention of concepts that students are learning. And no matter how strong my conceptual organization is when I'm designing a lesson, it doesn't matter if the perception of the lesson, of the information, of the content is not high quality. There are several concepts related to spatial organization and instructional design that can help me improve the way the information is perceived by students and other learners. One example of this is the concept of the golden rectangle. This is a classic geometric concept and is represented by a number 1.6183 something something something, and it's basically a ratio that can be simplified as if a square, a by a, becomes a rectangle, a plus b by a, then the a plus b to a is the same as a to b. Basically, when we have this sort of rectangle, like that depicted here, it's considered to be aesthetically pleasing and gives a harmonious perception. In fact, there are a tremendous number of things in nature that naturally follow this. The patterns of sunflower seeds in a sunflower, the nautilus in the ocean, hurricanes, and other weather patterns. It's all over the place. This ratio is all over in nature, and it may well be part of why we find it to be so harmonious. A similar concept is this idea of the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds when designing images and graphics, including PowerPoint or Keynote slides, is to think of things in terms of splitting an image into thirds horizontally and vertically, and then placing core information on the intersections of those lines. As you can see in this aesthetically pleasing image, that goat, or whatever it is, that mountain sheep, is along that line on the left-hand side. It's very close to the top left junction, and then the rock outcropping is close to the top right, and so forth. The entire rock mountain and then the forest behind it approximately follow the top and the bottom half, and the angle of the mountain cleanly dissects that rule of thirds graphing. So this might give us a way to understand why this image is aesthetically pleasing, such that we can begin to design with those concepts in mind. As you can see, it can also apply to slides like the ones that we've been exploring here. In this case, I tried to cluster the graphic on the left third and the text and the about balance between the right and middle thirds. And everything kind of has its place in there, with the focal point being the principles of graphic design, and that being exactly in the center of one of those intersections. Another really important space when designing graphics is this idea of white space. So for example, if I had to develop a slide where I have a little bit of text and I have some sort of a graphic, notice how much white space we have here. Of course, white space doesn't have to be white. The point is for it to be space that's background, that's not focused on, and it allows that which it is being focused on to pop out and draw attention to itself without distracting the viewer. Proximity is also an important concept. In this image from National Geographic, for example, you see two words on the screen, but you're most likely associating Antarctica with the image here, and emperor just seems out of place, strange, irrelevant. But when I flip them around, you begin to think about how emperor is describing the picture, and you might think, oh, that must be an emperor penguin, and the concept of this being in Antarctica might be far from your mind. So simply arranging the words such they are close to the image has a significant effect on how the image is perceived and the information that you get from it. Making sure that we cluster things that are appropriate to be together helps students understand what it is that we're trying to express with our images, our text, or the hybrid of the two. Next, we have this concept of alignment. Now, we can talk about alignment when it comes to images or text or the interplay between the two, but I want to focus just on text for a moment. Of course, we have the classic left-aligned text, right-aligned text, and center-aligned text. And then we also have justified text, which is typically used in newspapers and other print media, or vertical. Well, no one of these is always right or always the correct thing to use when designing educational graphics. The point is to be intentional about why the one that we're using is the appropriate one, how it provides aesthetically pleasing representation, and to try to be as consistent with the usage of that alignment as possible. The concept of symmetry and asymmetry in graphic design is very interesting. Typically, it is useful to have images either be symmetrical, like this one here, but asymmetrical is also perfectly fine, so long as there's a sense of balance, which is another concept, but a strongly related one. What we don't want to do is have unbalanced images. This slide with that huge space in the middle with nothing there is awkward. You know, it almost feels like something ought to be there. Did I not click something correctly, or did the graphic designer leave something out? Our minds don't like this sense of lack of balance. So if it's going to be asymmetrical, it must at least be balanced. When we do something that's symmetrical, it is by nature already balanced. The concept of contiguity in graphic design deals with the lines that people's eyes follow when they're looking at an image. Naturally, people who speak English and other languages that read top to bottom, left to right, all else being equal, will start in the top left-hand corner and read towards the bottom right-hand corner. There are ways to manipulate this with this placement of images, the use of lines, etc. In this case, a project that I created for week 1, you can see that there is a linear structure that goes through the graphic, demonstrating the path that I want people's eyes to take and ultimately reverse back. So when I look at it, I tend to look across the title, top to left to right, like an ordinarily would, reset to analyze, like you would in reading anything. And then my eyes follow that blue line all the way to the point, and then I step back and kind of see the whole picture. That was by design. It was the way that I wanted people to read this image. And we can manipulate that with those use of linear structures, whether it's the literal line or simply the way the images and graphics are set up to point towards certain places. This is a similar concept to what we oftentimes see in theater. With the way that people stand and turn their bodies, they can also form lines that create focal points on stage. Finally, I want to talk about this concept of contrast. It's critically important that we ensure that our viewers of our content can read and see clearly what we're presenting. If we have the best text in the world, but it's not legible, it's not readable because of poor contrast, then there's not a lot of good that's going to come of it. So here you see the dark gray on black is not good enough. It just, for some people, it's going to be practically invisible. Getting whiter is better, and having strong, sharp contrast is best. This also applies when we're using text on images, which is far more challenging. For example, I would not want to put white words on the ice, which is also quite white. The different colors, shades there where the better is, makes it so that that's a little bit awkward as well. But if I can find a spot in which there's nice, strong contrast, then it's perfectly fine to use text over an image, so long as there's solid, strong contrast. In this presentation, we talked about these applied terms of graphic design that represent graphic design both as conceptual and spatial. When these two combine, and I organize information in a way that makes sense, I support the way that people perceive, intake, and store information, and I do so in a way that is aesthetically pleasing and just enjoyable to look at. We help learners learn and maintain their learning.